Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Matt Bond. I'm a solution architect here at Ingram Micro, and I'll be hosting the webinar today, Defender for Endpoint Technical Webinar. So first, a bit of an agenda. We'll start off with an overview of what Defender for Endpoint is, an overview of its core functionality and features, and then after that we'll be spending the bulk of our webinar in a technical demo in the portal. So with that said, what is Defender for Endpoint? Defender for Endpoint is the endpoint security platform from Microsoft, which is intended to help you detect, investigate, and respond to threats, but also ensure that your devices are best prepared to deal for them in the first place and be a bit proactive. Defender for Endpoint comes currently in two plans. There's Plan 1 and there's Plan 2. Plan 2 is what we'll be looking at today because that contains the bulk of the feature set and the bulk of the functionality. Plan 1 is more of a lightweight product intended more for central management of antivirus. Defender for Endpoint Plan 2 is where you're going to find the real core functionality and the good features. Additionally, there is soon to be a Defender for Business product. Now this is going to be added to Business Premium sometime in March, but it will also be released as a standalone later this year. This is a product that's more optimized for SMBs. It largely contains the same functionality as Defender for Endpoint Plan 2, but a bit more cut down and a bit more focused for an SMB environment. So what are some of the core features of Defender for Endpoint, and really what we'll be looking at today in the technical demo? So the first is threat and vulnerability management. Now, threat and vulnerability management is a proactive element of Defender for Endpoint. This is where you'll be able to analyze and look at your current security configurations on your devices to improve your security. So looking for potential misconfigurations, but also potentially vulnerabilities found in out-of-date software. So it'll allow you to improve your overall security posture and minimize your exposure to risks. Then there's attack surface reduction. Now, that has a similar goal as threat and vulnerability management, where it's aiming to help you reduce the available surface for attackers to exploit and utilize during an attack. So this will utilize a mix of features and settings that you can configure to ensure that attackers can't utilize common exploits during an attack. An example would be preventing Office from creating a child process, as an example. Then we have next generation protection. Now, next generation protection is the first line of defense really with Defender for Endpoint. So this will work with Defender Antivirus to provide advanced cloud-based capabilities to prevent the more advanced threats and new threats. So this will utilize cloud-delivered protection in the form of various machine learning engines from Microsoft to analyze and block new threats near instantly. It will use behavior-based heuristics and real-time protection to monitor files and processes, and much more. Really, this is just your first line defense. It's an advanced antivirus component, but it's utilizing a great capability in the cloud from Microsoft to find new threats and block them quickly. Then there's endpoint detection and response. So the capabilities here are providing advanced real-time attack detections. So this will be what's generating alerts in the portal for you to investigate and respond to, and it'll provide you with a suite of investigation and response tools to make sure that no threat can get or make any progress on your devices. And now finally is automated investigation and remediation. The capabilities here provide advanced automation to ensure that threats are quickly and efficiently remediated using automation. So these capabilities will automatically investigate advanced threats and alerts and remediate them for you. So what this can do is save you time. So instead of analysts looking at the constant stream of alerts and investigating them themselves, automated investigation and remediation can actually start investigating these alerts for you when they pop up in the portal and remediating them as well. So this will allow our analysts or our IT staff to focus on more high value activities. That could be, say, focusing on threat and vulnerability management to improve the security configuration of devices, or even maybe dealing with a more sophisticated threat instead of high fidelity alerts. So with that said, what we'll now do is we'll hop into the portal and we'll start going through the functionality, the features on the portal of Defender for Endpoint. We're not going to go through absolutely every nook and cranny, but we're giving you an overview of what you need to know and the core functionality and what that looks like. So this is the Defender portal. So this is the Microsoft 365 Defender portal. This is where we'll see all the related alerts, configurations, and product information for all of Microsoft security products. So if you have Defender for Office 365 as well, you could see that here and configure that here. And you could also be able to see alerts from other products such as Defender for Identity or Defender for Cloud Apps. But today we're focusing on Endpoint. So once we're in this portal, the thing we want to really look at first is the threat protection elements. So how Defender handles threats and remediates them, but also the capabilities that we have to investigate and respond ourselves. Now they'll all be surfaced under instance and alerts. So our next generation protection, our endpoint detection response, this is where it will start surfacing those alerts for us to view. Because what Defender for Endpoint will do is it will surface attacks, threats, and other things as alerts, but also incidents. So there's the first thing, there's the alerts. So that's what you would expect. So you can see things here. Certain credential theft malware was prevented, suspicious behaviours, registry modified, and we can have a look at a bit of high level detail of that alert. So we can see some details, its classification, it was assigned to automation to handle, the category of attack, and its detection source. So this detection source was antivirus, but we could also see other detection sources such as EDR in here as well. Now that's one thing, and there's quite a lot of alerts here. So what Defender for Endpoint will do is it will correlate those alerts into incidents, which is here. Now what that really is Defender for Endpoint looking at a host of alerts and saying these represent a single attack. So we say have a bunch of alerts that are all on a single machine during a short time frame, that could represent a single incident and could be correlated together. Additionally, if we see multiple alerts on multiple machines, which say have similar attack tactics, they could also be correlated into an incident. So if we go to instance here, we can see we've got 3 incidents, and again, these are correlated alerts together. So I can click on this incident here and get a bit more high level detail. So I can see the name, so it's a multi-stage incident involving initial access and command and control, including ransomware. There's some tags that have been applied to it with ransomware and a few other attack elements. It's active, it's assigned to somebody, which is me, and we can see the categories of attack. So initial access, execution, persistence. Because what Defender for Endpoint will utilize is the MITRE ATT and CK tactics, which is essentially a way to categorize different attack tactics into the stage of a cyber attack. So initial access being initially accessing the device, but we could also have persistence methods to ensure that AV can't catch the attack. So it will tell us what attacks are being used and categorizing them. We can also manage this incident, so we can give it a different name if we like, we can apply different tags, and we can assign it to a different person. So right now this is assigned to me, which means if I was to go to the portal here, I could filter and only see instance applied to myself. But what I could also do is assign it to somebody else entirely. I can resolve the incident, which will just mean that I'm saying that it's all been resolved. Now once I do that, I can either say, by virtue of its classification, that it was a false alert or a true alert. Essentially what I'm saying is that it was a false positive or true positive. This allows the machine learning algorithms that Microsoft use to better train themselves so they're not constantly popping up alerts that aren't actually alerts. And we can also add comments in if we like. Now what we really want to do is actually click into one of these incidents and have a look, because this will take us to a dedicated incident page for us to conduct our investigation or our post-investigation analysis, depending if automation has handled it for us. So that's the overview. We'll see the alerts and the categories. So there's 115 active alerts. There's 7 tactics being used. So we can see here, 13 alerts initial access, 3 command and control. So it gives us a good idea of how many tactics are being used, but also potentially how severe this attack may be. If we're only seeing 1 or 2 tactics, that could be a more low fidelity alert, but if we're seeing over 7 tactics in this case, it could represent a more targeted attack or a more advanced and a more persistent threat. We can get an overview of the impacted devices, all the devices here, some high level incident information such as severity, when it was first and last seen, its classification, Now this is a cool element here where this will actually integrate with Microsoft compliance solutions, and it will tell you if there's any sensitive data on the affected devices here by looking at what tags and labels have been used in such as Word or Office. So what we'll do is we'll look at the alerts and we'll see there's over 195 alerts here. That's maybe not entirely representative of what we'd see in a real world scenario, but it does represent that in a lot of cases we'll simply get too many alerts that's reasonable for an analyst to handle on their own. So we can see a lot of alerts here, different malware prevented, suspicious discovery of a password policy, different events, malicious activity, and we can see how these are categorized by severity. So we can say severity is medium, low, informational or high, and it gives us an idea of how severe this incident really is by virtue of its alert's severity. We can see the impacted devices, the server source, so that's the vendor for endpoint. So we click into one of these alerts here, so we can see we have a malware that was prevented here. What we'll be able to look at is the complete alert story. So what's happened for this alert to be generated in the first place. We'll also see the affected device, so test server 2, it's a Windows Server 2019, and the account, which in this case is just the system account, NT Authority. So we can have a look through this alert story here. So we can see an exe was launched, it created a file, that file was prevented. Now, in many cases, this is what's going to be happening. It's going to find the malicious file and it's going to remediate them. But if we feel we need to do a bit more investigative work on our own end, we can click onto this file, and actually we can click on anything here, and we can have a bit more look, a more detailed look at this file's details. So we can see the virus total detection ratio, so how confident it is it's malware, the actual malware that was detected, when it was created, the file path, some details about the file itself, so file size, the file hash, and a bit more details. But we can actually click into the dedicated file page to do a bit more detailed work, to get a bit more detailed view into this file. So we can see, again, the same file details as before. This hasn't been associated with an incident because it was remediated, but if it was, we'd see that incident here, or how many, the virus total ratio, and the file prevalence. So this is prevalent in 3 devices in our organization and just under 2,000 worldwide. We can see any alerts it's associated with, so we can see 2, detected and prevented, but overall, for the investigation step, 2 were remediated. We can have a bit of a timeline of when this is first observed in our organization. So in this case, this was detected in February the 11th on test machine 3. Now we can submit this for a deep analysis. Now this is a feature that will essentially submit this to Microsoft to do a deep analysis on the file. And essentially what that really looks like is it'll open up in a containerized environment in a sandbox to monitor and see what that file does. For instance, you'll be able to see what IP addresses it's communicated with, if it attempts to change any registry values, that kind of thing. So if we are maybe investigating a file and we're not entirely sure about it, it's quarantined but we're not sure if it's actually malicious, we can submit it for a deep analysis to be sure. We can look at our file name, so it's only BD to the bin, but if this was observed anywhere else in the organization with a different file name, we'd see that here as well. Now, if we do want to take some response action here, we can stop and quarantine the file here, and this will submit an action to actually stop and quarantine the file. So this will apply in this case to 2 devices because it's been found on 2 devices. It would be more if it affected more devices, and we'd be required to put in a comment as to why we did this. Because then that would appear in the action center here, which we'll look at later, with details of why we did that. We can add it as an indicator. Now, if we add something as an indicator, what that essentially means is, if this is observed anywhere else on our environment or any other devices in the future, we can take an action on it. So we can see the action here. We can actually take a response action to this file. If it's seen in the future using its file hash, we can allow it, we can audit it, which means it will generate an alert but it won't do anything, or we can block and remediate it, in which case we can put in a custom alert title, the severity, information low or high, the category and the recommended actions, and description. Essentially all we're saying here is if we ever find this file again in the future, I want it blocked, I want that to generate an alert, And I'm going to give some details of what that alert should say. Additionally, I can download the file as well. So if we go back to our instance, that's the alerts. But what we also see is the devices that have been affected by this incident. So we have about 6 devices here, and we see the overall risk level, which is essentially how many alerts are on these devices and what a risk is associated with them. So we can see 35 alerts here, 21 alerts here, 27. So there's quite a lot going on these devices, and we'll probably want to do some investigative work to see and make sure that no threats have actually been or gone to a certain point of breaching our data or much more. We can get some high level detail. So for instance, we can click on the device here and we can see its domain, data sensitivity. So again, if there's any sensitive data on this by virtue of labels saying financial data, we would see that presented here. And we see how many active alerts are on this device. But what we want to do is we can go to a dedicated device page and do a bit more deep investigative work. So we can actually start looking at the various details about this device, maybe take some response actions, but generally speaking, we want to know what's going on. So again, we can get some device summary, some high level detail here. We can see the active alerts. We can see its security assessment. So this is threat and vulnerability management. So any recommendations, we'll look at that later though. We can click in and get more detail. So we can have a look at the alerts on this device. So quite a few. Most are resolved or new. We can get a timeline of events. Now this will be all events on the device. So generally speaking, you want to filter this to look for specific things that might interest you. So if I look down here, there's a whole host of events here. Since this is pretty much pulling in everything. But what I can do is I can filter this and maybe look for, say, firewall events or antivirus events. And then I can have a much more focused view on the different events that are occurring on this device. So you can see here that's a slightly smaller list. Different files observed, prevented execution of a Trojan. What we can also do in this event here, timeline, is we can flag these different events. And what that effectively means is we go to filters, we can say only show flagged events. So if we ever say leave this device page and go and do something else, but we still want to make sure we can have a look at these things later, we can say only flagged events. And then it will show us, after maybe a bit of a moment, all the flagged events on this timeline that we flagged. There'll be the security recommendations. That's using threat and vulnerability management to look for misconfigurations or potentially vulnerabilities. We'll look at that later. Same thing with software inventory. We can get a software inventory and any vulnerabilities of that software, any discovered vulnerabilities, any CVEs, and any missing knowledge bases. That's all great. Now, if we're looking at an incident here, we're probably being a bit more focused on the actual response to a threat. And that's where we do have some various response actions that we can take on this device. So we can go up here and we can see what these response actions are. So we can isolate the device. Now what this will do is it will isolate the device from the network. And the only thing the device can communicate with is Defend for Endpoint. We can optionally allow Outlook, Teams and Skype to continue. And when we do this, we do have to provide a comment as to why we did it. We can restrict app execution, meaning that we can make sure that the only applications that can run are ones that have been signed by Microsoft. So we can run an antivirus scan, in which case it would be a quick scan or a full scan. Again, provide a comment. We can collect an investigation package being along the lines of a zip file that contains a lot of information related to processes that are running, automated events, various network events, network connections. It's essentially a massive zip file that contains a lot of forensic information about the device that you can use to dig a lot more deeper into what's occurring on that device, which is maybe useful if you don't have direct access to it if it's a remote user. We can initiate a live response session. Now this is something we'll look at on another device because this is a demo device. So if I go down here to my device inventory, what I'll quickly do is hop into another device, this one here, and I'll initiate a live response session. because this is an extremely useful element of Defender for Endpoint, because essentially what it allows you to do is open a command line interface to the machine, where you can run various commands to investigate certain elements on the device, where you can say run PowerShell scripts if you upload them to the library, and do a lot more general investigative work, but the ability to run PowerShell scripts is also extremely useful. So if we say went here, we could upload to library and we could upload a PowerShell script. Now this is just loading for now, but what we can have a look at is we can see all the commands here. So there's a lot of things that we can do in the live response session. So we can analyze an entity for threats and it'll return a verdict. We can see all the drivers on the device, all the connections. We can see if certain files exist and get that file. We can list all the files in the library. So the library will be where we upload, up here, a PowerShell script. So if I say go to library, it'll tell me what scripts are currently uploaded, and there's only one. Now if I wanted to run a script, I could say type run script.txt. And then that'll take its time and it'll start running that script. Now, the script I've uploaded is incredibly basic, but you can upload more sophisticated scripts if you like. So what this effectively gives us the ability to do is have a much more in-depth response to a threat. Or potentially if we're doing post-threat or post-breach analysis of the device, if we want to ensure that malicious elements aren't there anymore, or like we're doing here, just running some scripts, we can see what processes are running, and if there's any persistence methods. Live response is definitely a much more intuitive and much more in-depth feature when it comes to device response actions, so we're not going to go for absolutely everything here, but it's definitely worth looking into in your own time as well. We can also look at the command log here, and we can get a list of all the commands that have been run on the device. Now, since this session isn't actually live, it's pending, we'll leave that for now, but it's definitely worth something looking into in your time. There's a good docs page on it, and it definitely helps you to enhance your incident response when it comes to individual machines. So go back to the original device and look at the rest of our response actions. So after a live response, we can initiate a general purpose automated investigation. So this won't be scoped or related to the current incident or alert. We'll just initiate a general purpose automated investigation to find any threats and remediate them. What we can also do is we have device value here. So device value is essentially a way to quantify the device's exposure score, which is part of vulnerability management, and allows us to indicate how valuable a device is. An example being, you might want to treat a Windows 10 laptop slightly different from a domain controller, or maybe slightly different from the device of a senior executive. So we can say the device values here, normal, low, high. So if I set it to high, I can submit that, and then that'll add a tag to say the device value is high. You can see it here as presented, which means if we have any analysts or maybe anyone who's generally speaking doing an investigation into a threat, they'll be able to see, well, this device value is high. I should maybe treat this slightly differently from other devices that maybe aren't not as important or maybe not as sensitive. So we'll go back to our incident. So that's the first two elements. We have our alerts and we have our devices, so we can see what alerts are part of this incident. We can click into them, and the same for the devices. We can click into them and get more detail. There's a few other things here that aren't exactly populated, users, mailboxes, and apps. This is where Defender for Endpoint and Defender in general from Microsoft will integrate the products together. So if you are using Defender for Office 365, if you are using Defender for Identity, it could also correlate alerts from those products into an incident together to have a full XDR experience. Now that's not worth showing right now, but it is a possibility. And it is good to know that generally speaking, Microsoft products do work well together. They work well, but they work well together as well. So next is the next major element, which are investigations. So our automated investigation and remediation capability. So whenever Defender for Endpoint finds an alert, it will start investigating that alert automatically. And if it can remediate it, it will. So we can see there's about 12 investigations here. Different attacks. So we have ransomware here, high severity malware, And we have to see in the status, so remediated, partially investigated, or no threats found. So if we say go to this one here, we can see what an investigation actually looks like from Defender for Endpoint. Because we can go to a dedicated investigation page to really look at what's being done on our devices and how the investigation on an automatic basis actually works from Defender for Endpoint. So we can see some investigation summary here, when it started, when it ended. So it lasted just over 14 minutes. We can see some investigation details, so its status is remediated. The severity in general is low, the category was malware, and it was detected by antivirus. And we get a bit of a graph here, a bit of a visual view, so to speak, into what's happening in this investigation. So it's investigating test machine 3. It received an alert, and there's 5 correlated alerts that are included in this investigation. It analysed over, or just under, 4,000 entities as part of this investigation and found 6 entities which were evidence of malicious activity. And we can click into all of these, so we can click onto the alerts and it'll take us to this alert page here. So again, we can see the alerts that are part of this investigation. If we want to, we can click on them again and get a bit more detail. And if we like, we can go back to the alert page and have a look there as well. We can see the device affected, so test machine 3, and we see the evidence. We have 6 entities which are evidence here. So we have the PowerShell, no threats found, so it's probably just running scripts. We have bdata.bin, which was suspicious. We have this exe, which was malicious, and it prevented it, and the same for these other files here. We can get a bit more detailed view on the entities that are investigated, so just under 3,000 files, 100 processes, 300 services. So just how this investigation expanded its scope and the work it does do. Generally speaking, something that's not going to be entirely possible for a human to do. 4,000 entities in 14 minutes, so it saves us a lot of time. Next thing is a log, so we can get a detailed log of what this investigation has done as part of this investigation. So we can see here it's pretty mundane stuff, so check coverage, or machine coverage, get the process list, find files by name, classify IP addresses, check for persistence methods, quarantine files. So a big thing here is transparency. Not all customers are fully willing to throw their heads in and trust automation completely, but this log does give us a bit of transparency to see what Defender for Endpoint is doing on our devices and how it is investigating and remediating threats. So we'll go back to the incident. And for all those investigations, we can see a more summarised and general view of the incident and response here. So we do have here the individual bits of evidence that are found, but we can look at it on a more broad basis here. So how many files were found, how many processes were found, how many URLs were found as evidence and the response. And it's taking a bit of time to load, but for instance, we have this URL here, we can click into it and we can see a bit more detail. So infinitysoftwares.com when it's suspicious. You can do the same for all the processes and all the files as well that have been regarded as evidence in this incident. So next what we'll look at is the graph. Now, the graph is a really useful element for us to get an understanding of what's happened during an incident and the scope and scale of an incident. Because it's giving us a graphical view, a visual of this incident. So we can see we can zoom in, so we can see all the devices that were affected, the processes that were malicious, so we can see them here. So we can see again the machine here, what files were found, bdata.bin, again these malicious elements. So it allows us to have a bit more of a user-friendly view, so to speak, not just looking at a long list of text and files. And we can have different views here. So this is grouping similar nodes together. If we want to, we can have them not group similar nodes together. So instead of grouping files all together, we can have them separate, which is a much bigger mess, but is maybe useful to kind of tell the story of how big in the scale of an attack was. And we can also change the layout here. So there's default, but we can also align the entity types together. So I'll go back to the default view, because the next part is really useful for kind of getting an idea of how things have progressed, which is the attack story. So we can actually play the attack story and get a minute-by-minute view of how this attack has progressed. So we can have different elements down here, so ransomware detected, behavior was blocked, but we can see how the scale of this attack is expanding and how it's including more and more entities, more and more machines as time goes on. And we can speed this up if we like. We can go all the way, and then we can even just end it, and we can see the true scale there. So this is particularly useful if, in the event of an incident being fully automated and fully investigated and remediated by a defender, we still want to get an idea of what happened. And we can use this here to do that. So that's the kind of instance and alerts. So you kind of get the idea of how Defender for Endpoint will generate alerts. But when those alerts represent a single attack and they're together, it will group them into incidents. Now it has really powerful automation capabilities under investigations that we can use to save us a lot of time or even completely remediate threats altogether. And the same, we can see all the devices affected and all the alerts affected. The other element we might want to think of is being a bit more proactive, maybe hunting for threats. Or even maybe just doing some post-breach investigation. So what hunting here does provides us with a feature called advanced hunting. Now, advanced hunting utilizes a lot of data from our machines. So you can see here as a schema, because essentially what advanced hunting is, it utilizes a language called KQL, which is a Microsoft proprietary data language to analyze and look for events and allows us to run queries to find certain things happening on devices. So you can see there's a lot of different tables here for other products, but I have devices here. So we can query for things such as device network info. So we can look for devices that have different network events, different process events, file events. Generally speaking, what it allows us to do is be a bit more proactive and actually actively hunt for threats, but also create our own custom alerts. Now I've done a bit here already, and we're not going to spend too much time here on advanced hunting because KQL can be extremely complex, and at the end of the day it is a language that needs to be learned, and you can completely benefit and enjoy Defender for Endpoint as a product without having to use this. But what I'll demonstrate very quickly is just what some of the queries would look like. So I've got a query written here already, which is, I'm looking at alert info, and I want to find alerts where the severity is high. Additionally, I want to see device info, where the device name contains a server, and where the OS platform is Linux. So I'm putting the where here to say where the device name is a server, and where the OS platform is Linux. And then we're using this project character here to say I only want to see the device name. And I'll just delete this here, but take means I only want to see one. But I can then run this query, and I can see all the machines, in this case it's only one, which have an alert severity of high, and where the device name is a server and it's Linux, and we're only projecting the device name. Now, KQL again is an advanced language. Well, not too advanced, but it's something to learn, and we're not going to go through it too much today. It's more to highlight the capability, because you can get a lot more complex queries, and more certainly things that I won't know too well myself either. For instance, I've got a query prepared here that's looking for files that have been moved to a USB device. So you can see it's quite extensive. We're not going to go through this bit by bit, and there won't be any results because I haven't moved any files to a USB, but it's an example of what you can use this advanced hunting tool for to conduct investigative elements into maybe more niche bits, such as, well, did this device move any files to a USB? I want to know that as well. Because what we can use this for to create our own custom alerts. Now these are called detection rules up here. So if I click on this, what this allows us to effectively create is our own alert to look for different elements that might not entirely be handled by the alerts and instance, that might not entirely represent an attack in that sense, but might provide us a bit more information and detail, or maybe just something we want to be aware of, such as a file being moved to a USB. So we can fill out some of these alert details rather. So we can see the detection name, which is file moved to USB. We can set the frequency, which is how often do we want to run that query, that KQL query we created. We could say every hour. We could provide the alert title. So when this actually surfaces in the portal under alerts, what will it be called? So file moved to USB. And the severity that alert will present as, we'll put it as informational, but we could put it as low, medium, or high. And then the category. So again, our ATT and CK tactics. So it could be privilege escalation, lateral movement. This entirely depends on the query that we create. But what I'll put it as suspicious activity. And we'll provide it a description. So USB or file moved to USB device. And we can also provide some recommended actions for when this surfaces an alert for what we want our analysts to do in response. So we'll select the impacted entities. So all of this essentially is saying what entities will be surfaced in the alert. So we'll say the device, and it's going to use its device ID or device name to identify that. And what we can then say is have some actions to take in response. So we can actually start automating certain response actions on the device using some of those response actions on those that we showed previously on the device page, such as isolating the device, collecting an investigation package, running an antivirus scan, initiating an automatic investigation, or restricting app execution. Now that's probably not too relevant for when, in this case, the query we have right now is for a USB having a file moved to it. But if we go ahead and get a bit more advanced, start constructing our own queries, we might also want to attach an automated action on top of that query. And that's what this would be useful for. In the same respect, if we had files affected here, maybe not again relevant to a USB query, but we could say allow or block it, allow or block the file, or quarantine the file. We can then scope that, so we'll say all devices. Device groups are something that we'll create in the portal, which is just to segment our devices together, but we won't show that right now. But we could say all devices, and then we can create this custom alert, essentially. They're called custom detection rules, but in reality what they're doing is allowing you to create your own custom alert. And we'll give that a moment, and that's it done. And we can see these presented under here, under custom detection rules. And we can click into them again. We could run the query if we like, we can modify it, we could edit the rule, or delete it, or turn it off as well. And just to kind of finish off here in advanced hunting, again, we didn't go through too much detail here in advanced hunting, but if you do want to get a bit more in depth with providing security to your customers using Microsoft security, KQL is a very good skill set to learn. KQL will be used for other products such as Microsoft Sentinel, which is Microsoft's SIEM and SOAR platform. And generally speaking, it allows us to stretch out what we can do with, in this case, Defender for Endpoint, but it'll also cover other things such as email, alerts, etc. So it's definitely worth looking at, worth learning. You can find good courses on MS Learn, but you can also find some courses on other sites such as Pluralsight. Just finally, on the more threat protection element, there's threat analytics. Now what threat analytics is, it's slightly different from what we've looked at before, because what threat analytics is it's preventative, proactive, but also responsive at the same time. Because what this will do is give you details on the latest threats around the world. It will give you insights on how you can better prepare to ensure that these threats don't affect you. So we can see here the latest threats, so targeting Ukraine organizations, malware profile emotets, high impact threats. We can see if any of these have actually affected our organization, in which case they have, by virtue of me simulating them. The highest exposure threats, this is once we start to dig into threat and vulnerability management, so we can see what threats are we highly exposed to. In this case, we aren't really exposed to any, they're low. And we can see all the threats down here. We can see if we have any impacted assets, any active alerts relating to this threat. We can see our threat exposure level, so low. We can see misconfigured devices, so we can see how many devices we have in our environment that might be potentially susceptible to this threat and what we can do to remediate that. So what I'll do is I'll click into this threat here, and we can go to a dedicated threat insights page. So this will give us an overview of what this threat is. So in this case, it's Ukrainian organisations getting hacked. So it's maybe not too relevant to us, but it generally shows the purpose of threat insights. We can see any related incidents, the alerts over time, if we have any impacted assets, our exposure, and if we've had any prevented email attempts associated with it. So this would be if we're using Defender for Office 365. We can get a full-blown analyst report, which provides us a lot of detail into this threat through virtue of an executive summary, the available mitigations we can take to ensure it doesn't affect us, give us some information to actually hunt for this threat, and much more. So it gives us a full-blown analyst report by a cybersecurity professional at Microsoft, again tracked by here, Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center, to give us a bit more information and probably some tips on how we can prepare for this threat. But not only just this threat, by reading through this here, we'll get a bit more information how we can prepare for other threats in general, because it'll have best practices that we can follow. If we have been affected by this threat, we can see any related incidents, which we have none, impacted assets, which we have none, and the same with prevented email attempts. Now, the thing that we'll really want to look at and focus on is exposure and mitigations, because what this can help us with is actually ensuring that we're better prepared for threats like this anyway, before they come to our doorstep. So we can see here we have some security configurations that we can put into place. So security controls, antivirus, so enable cloud delivered protection, attack surface reduction rules, endpoint detection response, so enabling certain features, and if we have any vulnerabilities that are being exploited by this threat actor that we might want to clear up. So if we have any out-of-date software, as an example, on our devices that has an exploit that's being utilised by this threat actor, it will tell us here. And this is really how we start to dive into threat and vulnerability management, because we've looked at instance alerts, automated investigations, how we can hunt for threats using the KQL query language. Now that's all to a certain degree reactive. What we really want to be is proactive with our device security. And that's where threat and vulnerability management comes in under here, vulnerability management. So we'll start off in the dashboard. Because essentially, like we've said before, threat and vulnerability management allows us to be proactive, to find misconfigurations, vulnerabilities on our devices, and ensure we're better prepared for threats before they happen. So on this dashboard, we'll get a few things to look at. We'll see an organizational exposure score, so how exposed we are to an organization. That score is calculated using things such as our available recommendations for configuration, our vulnerabilities, that kind of thing. Will give us some threat awareness. So in this case, it's using the log4j vulnerability and saying how many devices we have affected. We have 0. Top security recommendations, top events that have actually affected our score, our exposure distribution. So it's mostly low, but some medium in terms of our devices, and our top exposed devices. So this is all more insight based, because what we really are looking at is under here, the recommendations. So this will give us all the recommendations to improve security on our devices. Now this can be something a bit more mundane, such as update Microsoft Edge, in which case we can click onto this. We can see it's got a few vulnerabilities associated with it. So we generally speaking should update our Edge, how many devices we have exposed, it's been installed in 3 devices, and we can actually look in and get in detail the associated CVEs, which are the vulnerabilities that can be exploited by attackers. What we can also get on these recommendations is insights here under threats. So for instance, we have one here for updating Windows 10. We can see here, threat insights. So that is indicating to us if this is a bit more serious, because in this case, a public exploit is available for one of these weaknesses that's relating to this recommendation. So that means we might want to treat this with a bit more seriousness and actually ensure that we're updating, in this case, Windows 10. So we can click on this and we can even go to a dedicated software page, in this case for Windows 10, and get a bit more high level and detailed view of what we can do to improve, in this case, the security of Windows 10. So we can get an overview, so 18 vulnerabilities, 58 misconfigurations, 1 exposed device out of 4 currently. We can see a list of security recommendations. Now this is largely all we're going to see here under recommendations because it's Windows 10. vulnerabilities, the installed devices, the version distribution. So we've got 3 different versions of Windows currently. Any missing knowledge bases, so we're missing a security update. And we can see an event timeline, a timeline of events have affected the vulnerability of this software. Now what we can do with these recommendations here is we can start to bridge the gap between security administration and IT administration. And what I mean by that is we can say, for instance, go here to block the execution of potentially scripts. So we can click here and we can look at this recommendation. We can get a bit of detail of the description of the recommendation, the potential risk involved in not doing it. We can look at our exposed devices, but what we want to do is request a remediation. Because this will allow us to create a ticket in this case Intune, Endpoint Manager, for someone else to view and actually start putting in place that recommendation. So I can put through the recommendation request, I'll tick here, open a ticket in Microsoft Endpoint Manager. What's the due date? So I'll say I want this done by next week. What's the priority? I'll say it's a low priority and I can add some notes for whoever's handling this to view. Please handle this, thanks. And what I can do is then I'll create that remediation activity. Additionally, if I like, I can create an exception instead. So if I don't want this to affect my score, I don't want this to surface, I can create an exception. And what we'll see these surface as is in remediation down here. So we can see here all the remediation activities will surface here. Give it some time to load, so we'll see we have 3 remediation activities. We can track their progress. We see if it's been approved or not, its priority, and a bit more detail about this remediation. And if we do create exceptions, we'd also see them here. Now, when it comes to how this bridges the gap between IT and security administration, what we can then do is go to the Endpoint Manager portal up here. Now, a bit of forward, this isn't something we're talking about today. Intune and Endpoint Manager are a completely different product. Again, this is something we can help you with in training and development for your team. If you want to talk about this, reach out and we will. But what we'll do is we'll go to Endpoint Security under here. And what we can look at is security tasks. And we can see those 3 remediations that we requested in Defender for Endpoint are surfaced here in the portal. So here's the one that we requested about scripts. So we can click onto this and see the similar detail we saw previously. So it's going to tell us how to do it. It's going to utilize our attack surface reduction rules, what we need to enable, and other steps as well. We can accept this or we can reject it. If we accept it, it'll appear under here as being approved and accepted. If we reject it, it'll show that it's being denied. So we'll accept this. I'll put yes. You'd probably put a bit more detail in a real life scenario. And then that'll actually start indicating to whoever's handling Defender for Endpoint, again, it could actually be the same person, that this remediation is in progress. And now this is a really good kind of segue into the next thing that we can talk about when it comes to Defender for Endpoint, which is attack surface reduction. Because we're requesting an attack surface reduction rule here to be put into place. And that's found and configured in the Endpoint Manager Admin Center. Now, a bit of a primer again, attack surface reduction. These are the rules and settings that we can configure to reduce the available attack surface for an attacker to exploit. So this can be things like we see here, preventing certain scripts from running, blocking Office from running child processes. But what these are found under is attack surface reduction. There's a lot more settings here in this portal, and we don't have the time to go through all of them, so we'll focus now on the attack surface reduction. So we can create a policy. We'll select our platform, and what we want to look at are attack surface reduction rules. There's other things here, and they accomplish different parts, especially when it comes to the Windows operating system. But right now, we'll just look at the rules. So essentially, these are a list of rules that we can configure to reduce the attack surface, to make sure that attackers can't exploit certain parts of software or the operating system. So I'll quickly name this, and we can see we get a whole host of rules that we can configure. So blocking persistence through WMI event subscription, we can block that, or we can put it in audit mode where we'll simply get an informational alert. Block Adobe Reader from creating child processes. Block Office from creating child processes. We have some additional features that we'll definitely want to consider executing and enabling, such as advanced protection against ransomware, which this means it allows Defender for Endpoint to take a bit more of a strict approach to potential ransomware. We can enable folder protection, which will allow us to prevent our core folders from being modified by applications, which is a tactic that ransomware will use, in which case we can add additional folders that need to be protected, apps that have access, and we can exclude certain files and paths from these rules as well at the bottom, all these rules. Now we're not going to go through every single one of these rules because they all accomplish different things, and generally speaking, you don't want to enable them for no reason. You want to look into them and see what they do. But if we do have a bit of a look, we do go through and enable some of these, we're reducing that attack surface that attackers can exploit. So that's attack surface reduction rules. Again, this is something that you definitely want to hop into a portal, create a demo environment and have a look through yourself. Go through the docs page. There's an extensive docs page for pretty much all of these elements. So block persistence here, I can click learn more, and there's a dedicated docs page for the different rules available. It's definitely worth looking through because they definitely help us be more proactive in our endpoint security and ensure that attackers don't have as much ground to work with. So go back to the Defender portal, and that's the remediation. Additionally, we get a few other things. We get the software inventory. So this is where we get a list of the software that's on our endpoint devices and any vulnerabilities and weaknesses that's been found on those. So like we looked at before, we have Windows 10 here. There's 18 weaknesses and has some threats associated with it. So there's an exploit available. Now I've got some Linux servers here, so we're seeing a lot of Linux stuff. But generally speaking, what we can just do is we can filter by the number of weaknesses and prioritize it that way. But generally speaking, it allows us to cover more than just the endpoint configurations. We can have a look and see if there's actually software on our devices that potentially need updated as well. Because what this will also do is it will give some informational tags if they exist. So for instance, if you have a bit of software that's approaching end of life and will no longer be supported or updated, it might actually inform you that as well. And generally speaking, anything in this portal, anything in the Defender portal, you can filter it. So we can filter it by the operating system, if it has weaknesses or not, if there's exploits available. So if I say do that, I can filter that. We can do that with pretty much everything on this portal. Pretty much everything can be filtered to a certain degree. We can look at the weaknesses, so the CVEs that are associated with our organization. So this will be things like exploits that can be utilized on Windows 10 as an example. We can see here, we can see the name of the CVE, we can see the severity, and the related software. So a lot of Google Chrome here, but also Windows 10. We can see how old it is, when it was published, and how many exposed devices we have. And we can get a bit more detail if we click into it as well. So in this case, we have the CVE here. It affects the following vendors. So Google, Microsoft, Ubuntu, Debian. The vulnerability name, it's got a high severity. And we can see all the devices affected. And this will link in with the recommendations because we can go to the related security recommendation to ensure, in this case, we have the right thing. It's update Microsoft Edge Chromium. That's how we deal with this CVE, with this vulnerability. And just lastly, on vulnerability management, we have the event timeline. So this will be just a timeline of events that have affected our vulnerability. So you can see it here. Microsoft Office has 5 new vulnerabilities. That was on the 8th. Microsoft Edge Chromium has a new vulnerability impacting one device on the 11th. We can click into that as well and go to the related security recommendation. So this just allows us to have a bit more of a timeline view into what's happening on our devices in our organization and to ensure that we're up to date with the latest developments. So that being vulnerability management, we'll now look at some additional elements. They're not main features, they're not the main parts that everybody's interested in, but just some of the stuff that's nice to have. So we first have the reports. So we can get some detailed reports, and again, there's some other products here, but for endpoints, we can get reports on our threat protection. So we can get detailed reports. And again, this is something that we could show to a stakeholder, show the value of the product. So we can see the detection source of alerts. It's mostly EDR and antivirus. Currently unresolved alerts. Threat categories of currently unresolved alerts. So this gives a bit of a visibility into what's happening in relation, in this case, to threat protection in our environment. We get some additional reports, so device health and compliance, so to ensure our devices are properly communicating with Defender for Endpoint. So health state active, impaired communications inactive. The antivirus status updated unknown. The OS platforms are running, the Windows versions, OS platforms and Windows versions. Again, a bit more of a detailed view into the actual, in this case, device health and organization, but also what version of Windows we might be running. The next thing we will look at is there's a web protection report here. Now, there's nothing here, but it allows us to segue into the next thing we can talk about, which is a lot of questions we'll get asked from customers is there a way to block certain websites using Defender for Endpoint? And the answer is yes. There's a web protection feature which allows you to block entire categories of websites. So what we'll do now is we'll look at the settings for that, because that's found in settings down here, and then endpoints. Now again, there's a lot of things here that we've not really looked at, but we'll kind of leave it because we wouldn't have the time to go through absolutely everything. But we can go down here and we can look at web content filtering. So what this allows us to do is to create a policy that can ban entire categories of websites. So we'll put the policy name in here, put test, and you can see here what we can ban. So we can ban adult content, high bandwidth websites, so download sites, image sharing, peer-to-peer, legal liability, leisure, and uncategorized, such as new registered domains and parked domains. So we can create a policy to completely block these categories and ensure that any of our users on our devices can't access them. Additionally, just to kind of square off, there are some advanced features that you might want to look at as well within Defender for Endpoint. A lot of these are going to be enabled by default. There's features such as EDR and block mode. That's useful if you have another antivirus being the primary antivirus. This still allows Defender for Endpoint to exist as a second line defense and block anything that the main AV doesn't find. Tamper protection to ensure that our users can't actually modify or change security settings on the endpoints. Various integrations with Defender for Identity, Defender for Cloud Apps. Again, Defender for Endpoint is really good at integrating with other security products from Microsoft. Connect to Intune, so that's how we were able to get that security task surfaced in the endpoint portal through this connection, and a few other bits as well. And just lastly, the thing I will touch on before we finish is how do we onboard devices? Now, Defender for Endpoint is incredibly easy to onboard for your endpoints because it utilizes a sensor that is already available on the device by virtue of Windows 10, Windows 11. So what we can do down here, we have device management, onboarding. We can see the different operating systems that are covered by Defender for Endpoint, so what Windows 10, 11, server, Mac OS, Linux, iOS, and Android, and the deployment methods we have. So we can deploy in a few ways. We have a local script. Now that's generally for testing purposes, not production, and that'll be useful for up to 10 devices and that'll recommended. We have group policy, Microsoft Endpoint Configuration Manager, SCCM, Intune, and onboarding scripts for VDI, non-persistent devices. And once we've done that, we can then run this detection test here, which is a PowerShell script, to ensure that the onboarding is successful. The easiest way and the most recommended way from myself would be using Microsoft Intune, MDM, because essentially, and we're not going to look at it right now because it's an entirely different product, it makes it incredibly easy to onboard devices if you're using Intune already, because all you're really doing is creating a single configuration profile and applying that to users and devices. And it makes it even possible to ensure that onboarding to Defender for Endpoint is automated, because we can also make Intune relatively automated when it comes to device enrollment with automatic enrollment. So that's been the live technical demo of Defender for Endpoint. We covered a lot of ground, and it might have felt rushed in certain stages, but it's important to note that Defender for Endpoint is a really large product. It covers a lot of ground, a lot of areas, and it's not possible to go through in immense detail everything, but it's also a bit of a challenge to fit everything into a single webinar. So what we'll do is we'll go back to the slides now and finish up our webinar. So that's been the kind of technical live demo we've went through now, and we're closing up the webinar now, and that's kind of the bulk of the content over. But what I want to briefly touch on is how Ingram Micro Cloud can help you with not just Defender for Endpoint, but Microsoft security in general and Microsoft in general. So there's first thing, it's training. So I myself, as a solution architect, can provide you with one-to-one training or one-to-many training for your team to help you get started with this product and other products within Microsoft security and compliance. So we can get on a Teams call, go through the product, do some demos, but we can also answer queries for you and questions that you might have. Because the second thing is pre-sales. If you have a customer who's potentially interested in this product and you're maybe not possessive of the capability to demo it yourself, get in touch with Ingram Micro Account Manager, who can arrange some time with myself, and we can provide a demo to your customer for you. And then the third one is professional services. If you don't have the in-house capability and you want to be able to sell and deploy these products to your customers, we have an extremely experienced team in our professional services subsidiary, ComScare, who can deliver these services and these products for you, and all other products within Microsoft Security as well. So again, if this is something you're interested in, reach out to Ingram Micro and your account manager. And with that said, that concludes the webinar for today. We will be doing an additional 2 webinars on Microsoft Security products. That'll be the next one next month and then the month after. But again, if you're interested in these products, you want to learn more, reach out to your account manager. They can arrange some time with myself. We can do some one-to-one training, one-to-many training, or even provide some demos for your customers as well. So with that, thank you for joining us today. And if you have any questions, please reach out to your account manager.